ship was given at 5 p.m. For most of the men, however, no order was needed, because by then everybody knew that the ship was done, and that it was time to give up trying to save her. There was no show of fear or even apprehension. They had fought unceasingly for 3 days, and they had lost. They accepted their defeat almost apathetically. They were simply too tired to care. Frank Wild, the second in command, made his way forward along the buckling deck to the crew's quarters. There, 2 seamen, Walter Howe and William Blakewell, were lying on the lower bunks. Both were very exhausted from nearly 3 days at the pumps, yet they were unable to sleep because of the sounds that the ship was making. She was being crushed, not all at once, but slowly, a little at a time. The pressure of 10 million tons of ice was driving against her sides, and dying as she was, she cried in agony. Her frames and planking, her immense timbers, many of them almost a foot thick, screamed as the killing pressure mounted. And when her timbers could no longer stand the strain, they broke with a report like artillery fire. Most of the forecastle beams had already gone earlier in the day, and the deck was heaved upward and working slowly up and down as the pressure came and went. Wild put his head inside the crew's quarters. "She's going, boys," he said quietly. "I think it's time to get off." Howe and Blakewell rose from their bunks, picked up 2 pillowcases on which they had stowed some personal gear, and followed Wild back up on the deck. Farther forward, the dog team drivers had attached a large piece of canvas to the port rail and had made it a sort of a chute down to the ice alongside the ship. They took the 49 huskies from their kennels and slid each one down to the other men waiting below. Ordinarily, any other activity of this sort would have made the dogs mad with excitement, but somehow they seemed to sense that something very extraordinary was happening. Not one fight broke out among them, and not a single dog attempted to break away. It was perhaps the attitude of the men. They worked with a deliberate urgency, hardly speaking to one another. There was no display of alarm, however. In fact, apart from the movement of the ice and the sounds from the ship, the scene was one of relative calm. The temperature was 8.5 degrees below zero. The light southerly wind was blowing, and overhead the twilight sky was clear. The ship reacted to each fresh wave of pressure from the ice in a different way. Sometimes she simply quivered briefly, as a human being might wince as if by a single stabbing pain. Other times she retched in a series of convulsive jerks, accompanied by anguished outcries. On these occasions, her 3 masts went violently back and forth, as the rigging tightened like harp strings. But most agonizing for the men were the times where she seemed a huge creature just suffocating and gasping for breath, her sides heaving against the strangling pressure. More than any other single impression in those final hours, all the men were struck, almost to the point of horror, by the way the ship behaved like a giant beast in its death agonies. By 7 p.m., all of the essential gear had been transferred to the ice, and a camp of sorts had been established on a solid floe a short distance to starboard. The lifeboats had been lowered the night before, and they went over to the side of the ice, and most of the men felt an immense relief being away from the doomed ship. However, the general feeling of relief of being off the ship was not shared by one man, at least not in the larger sense. He was a thick-set individual with a wide face and a broad nose, and he spoke with the trace of an Irish brogue. During the hours that it took to abandon the ship, he had remained more or less apart as the equipment, dogs, and men were getting off. His name was Sir Ernest Shackleton, and the 27 men he watched so ingloriously leaving their stricken ship were the members of his Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The date was October 27, 1915. The name of the ship, Endurance. Their location was deep in the icy wasteland of the Antarctic's treacherous Weddell Sea, just about midway between the South Pole and the nearest known outport of humanity, some 1,200 miles away. And now I will skip over to the ending. This is There was an advance crew that went before to try and find some help. And this is when Shackleton and 2 crew members are at the very top of a very rugged mountain that they are trying to descend. Shackleton hacked out a small platform with the adze and then called to the others to come down. There was no need to explain the situation. Speaking rapidly, Shackleton said simply that they faced a clear-cut choice. If they stayed where they were, they would freeze. In an hour, maybe 2, maybe longer. But they had to get lower and with all possible haste. So he suggested they slide. Worsley and Crean were stunned, especially for such an insane solution to be coming from Shackleton of all people. But he wasn't joking. He wasn't even smiling. He meant it, and they knew it. But what if they hit a rock? Crean wanted to know. Could they stay where they were? Shackleton replied, his voice rising. But the slope, Worsley argued. What if it didn't level off? What if there were another precipice? Shackleton's patience was going. Again he demanded, could they stay where they were? Obviously they could not. And Worsley and Crean reluctantly were forced to admit it. Nor was there really any other way of getting down. And so the decision was made. Shackleton said they would slide as a unit. They quickly sat down and untied the rope that held them together. Each of them coiled up to his share to form a mat. Worsley locked his legs around Shackleton's waist and put his arms around Shackleton's neck. Crean did the same with Worsley. They looked like 3 tobogganers without a toboggan. Altogether, it took little more than a minute, and Shackleton did not permit any time for reflection. When they were ready, he kicked off. And the next second, their hearts stopped beating. They seemed to hang poised for a split second, and then suddenly the wind was shrieking in their ears and a white blur of snow tore past. Down, down, down. They screamed, not in terror necessarily, but simply because they couldn't help it. It was squeezed out of them by the rapidly mounting pressure in their ears and against their chests. Faster and faster, down, down, down. Then they shot forward onto the level, and their speed began to slacken. A moment later, they came to an abrupt halt in a snowbank. The 3 men picked themselves up. They were breathless, and their hearts were beating wildly, but they found themselves laughing uncontrollably. What had been a terrifying prospect, possibly 100 seconds before, had turned into a breathtaking triumph. They looked up against the darkening sky and saw the fog just curling over the edge of the ridges, perhaps 2,000 feet above them. And they felt that special kind of pride of a person who in a foolish moment accepts an impossible dare and then pulls it off to perfection. They followed a stream, and about 3 o'clock they looked ahead and saw that the stream ended abruptly in a waterfall. They reached the edge and leaned over. There was a drop of about 25 feet, but it was the only way. The ravine here had grown to the size of a gorge, and its sides were perpendicular and offered no way of getting down. There was nothing to do but go over the edge. With some trouble, they found a boulder large enough to hold their weight, and they made one end of the rope fast to it. All 3 of them pulled off their burberries, in which they wrapped the adze, the cookpot, and Worsley's diary, and then pitched them over the side. Crean was the first to go down. Shackleton and Worsley lowered him, and he reached the bottom, gasping and choking. Then Shackleton lowered himself down through the water, and Worsley was last. It was an icy ducking, but they were at the bottom, and from there the ground was almost level. The rope could not be recovered, but they picked up the 3 articles that remained and started off for the station, now only a mile or so away. Almost simultaneously, all of them remembered their appearance. Their hair hung down almost to their shoulders, and their beards were matted with salt and blubber oil. Their clothes were filthy, threadbare, and torn, almost 2 years after they had set out. Worsley reached under his sweater and carefully took out 4 rusty safety pins that he had hoarded for almost the entire 2 years. With them, he did his best to pin up the major rents in his trousers. Matthias Anderson was a station foreman at Stromness. He had never met Shackleton, but along with everyone else at South Georgia, he knew that the Endurance had sailed from there in 1914 and had undoubtedly been lost with all hands in the Weddell Sea. Suddenly, he heard an outcry and looked up. 2 small boys, about 11 years old, were running, not in play, but in terror. Behind them, Anderson saw the figures of 3 men, walking slowly and with great weariness in his direction. He was puzzled. They were strangers, certainly, but that was not so unusual as the fact that they were coming not from the docks where a ship could come in, but from the directions of the mountain, the interior of the island. As they drew closer, he saw that they were heavily bearded, and their faces were almost black except for their eyes. Their hair was as long as a woman's and hung down almost to their shoulders. For some reason, it looked stringy and stiff. Their clothing was peculiar, too. It was not the sweaters and boots worn by seamen, but instead the three men appeared to be wearing parkas, though it was hard to tell because their garments were in such a ragged state. By then the workmen had stopped what they were doing to stare at the three strangers approaching. The foreman stepped forward to meet them, and the man in the center spoke in English. "Would you please take us to Anton Anderson?" he said softly. The foreman shook his head. Anton Anderson was not at Stromness any longer, he explained. He had been replaced by the regular factory manager, Thoraf Sorrel. The Englishman seemed pleased. "Good," he said. "I know Sorrel well." The foreman led the way to Sorrel's house, about 100 yards off to the right. Almost all of the workmen on the pier had left their jobs and had come to see the three strangers appear at the dock. Now they lined the route, looking curiously at the foreman and his three companions. Anderson knocked at the manager's door, and after a moment, Sorrel himself opened it. He was in his shirt sleeves and sporting a handlebar mustache. When he saw the three men, he stepped back, and a look of belief came over his face. For a long moment, he looked shocked and silent before he spoke. "Who are you?" he said at last. The man in the center stepped forward. "My name is Shackleton," he replied in a quiet voice. Again, there was silence. Sorrel turned away